right, that was a tremendous press conference by United States President Donald Trump, who answered questions from both American and Indian media. A freewheeling discussion, like he mentioned. He was very focused when he spoke about India. He, of course, spoke about his welcome, saying that it was the grandest welcome any dignitary has ever received in India. He was very specific when talking about India and its future, saying that India is going to be a major global player over the next 10, 20, 50 to 100 years, recognizing India's role in the global stage as well. He spoke on a range of issues, from the Afghan-Taliban deal to Islamic terror to Kashmir, but he also skipped certain issues as well. One of it was the CAA, saying that it is up to India to deal with the situation. He spoke on Pakistan. He spoke on Kashmir as well, saying that India and Pakistan have been at loggerheads for a long time, and he will do whatever he can to ease the situation. Donald Trump also spoke on Islamic terror, saying that no one in the world probably has done more to combat Islamic terror in the history of the world than Donald Trump. He says that in Iraq and Syria, when he came to power, ISIS was all over. He claims credit for United States leading the war on terror, saying that the caliphate leadership is gone, and that the United States has taken out terrorists like Baghdadi, and he also encouraged other nations like Russia, Iran, Iraq and Syria to play a bigger role in fighting terror. Bhairavi Singh, my colleague, joins us on the phone line. Bhairavi, it was a freewheeling press conference. Certain issues we expected Donald Trump to touch upon, like Islamic terror, Pakistan, Kashmir, featured in this press conference. On the trade deal, he also appeared satisfied, saying that Indian companies are investing more and more in the United States, but he said that a formal deal would only come into place by the end of the year.
Well, absolutely. It was a freewheeling conversation, and he did touch upon a lot of topics. But what's interesting is that he, made a very quite a clear statement right at the beginning when he says, look, I'm not going to say anything controversial, as you're all going to blow it up and put it out of perspective. So I'm going to be very careful of what I'm saying. And that indeed he was sure that the entire time he sidestepped many issues. He was asked quite a few times about whether you raised the issues of religious freedom, about Kashmir. Did you offer to mediate between the two sides, India and Pakistan? Did you raise terror emanating from Pakistan? And he kept it very simple and very, very neutral. He kept saying, look, I discussed it, and I was very satisfied with the answers that I got from Prime Minister Modi, whether it was on religious freedom or what they were doing in terms of policies as far as Citizenship Amendment Act is concerned, or otherwise. So he said, I asked these questions in front of a big audience, and all the answers that I got from Prime Minister Modi were satisfactory. On questions on trade, of course, he gave mixed signals. He did indeed say that we are going to sign a tremendous deal. Things are looking up, that's optimistic. However, he said that, India understands our problems. India is one of the largest has one of the largest trade tariffs, and those are issues that need to be resolved. Both sides are working on it. So, it almost looked like, yes, there were hot negotiations, back-channel negotiations while President Trump was here. He also spoke at length with his meetings with the business leaders here. He said, I don't think that the media understands the importance of some of the business leaders that I met here in India, and that we're taking back many good inputs, and it's been overall a very, very productive 2 days. Shobhit.
Absolutely. You're spot on. Donald Trump did at the very start mention that he's going to keep this press briefing very controversial. However, the most aggressive questions put forth to Donald Trump were by the American media, talking about a lot of domestic issues, and back home he also touched upon the upcoming elections. He spoke about Bernie Sanders and everything. Bhairavi, while speaking about religious freedom with the Prime Minister Modi, Donald Trump mentioned that India is committed to religious freedom, but he was also asked about his own administration's travel ban, isn't it? And Donald Trump defended that decision of his administration to impose travel ban from individuals traveling to America from certain regions of the world. He said, though, that it's not anti-Muslim, the American travel ban that he was talking about.
Well, that's the beauty of the American democracy in the sense there were some very hot questions thrown at him from the American press. There was a back and forth between him and the CNN, anchor, correspondent, reporter, senior White House correspondent as well. Several, members who have been, on the fight with him. Many questions about the Russian meddling. There were questions about his own policies when it came to Muslims. And he said, well, it wasn't entirely a Muslim ban. It was a travel ban on countries where we thought that there would be trouble emanating from. And this was in the context of what the BBC reporter actually asked him, that why weren't you more direct about some of the problems coming out of the Indian administration's decision when it comes to NRC, CAA, what's happening in Northeast Delhi currently, did you ask relevant questions to Prime Minister Modi? And he said, well, I asked relevant questions and I was satisfied. And, the subsequent question by the BBC journalist was why your own record on Muslims has not exactly been good, to which he, of course, answered. So, as I said, to the script, Donald Trump took a lot of questions. There were a lot of questions from the foreign press that had nothing to do with actually his trip here in India. So there was a lot of back and forth. There were over 200 journalists here, show, but everybody wanted to ask questions. He answered quite a few. There were many questions on the energy sector, on trade. He said that we were cooperating in the Indo-Pacific, counter-terrorism, that you will see a lot happening in the energy sector. One thing that was a red flag in the energy sector was he said that, yes, there will be sanctions on Venezuela. When somebody asked him, will those sanctions also affect Indian companies as far as oil is concerned? And he said, well, you'll have to see. So obviously trouble for India when it comes to sanctions on Iran and sanctions on Venezuela, both suppliers of oil to us. And the beneficiary of those sanctions, of course, have been American companies. As we know that ExxonMobil and ONGC have signed, deals for oil imports, and America has now become a sixth largest crude oil supply as well. So whatever benefits are coming, they're coming now to American companies as sanctions continue on countries like Venezuela and Iran.
Bhairavi, stay with us. Also joining us live on this broadcast is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. Siddhant Sibal was at the press briefing which Donald Trump just concluded. Siddhant, it was a very wide-ranging press briefing, isn't it? Very important points that Donald Trump mentioned as well on religious freedom, on Kashmir and trade. Now, we'll go one after the other. As far as religious freedom is concerned, he said that India is committed towards religious freedom. He steered clear very much of the CAA topic that was brought up. The question was put up to him many times, isn't it?
Well, it was a freewheeling press conference by the US President Donald Trump here in Delhi, and the PC almost lasted 45 minutes. When it comes to religious freedom, he confirmed that he spoke about this with the Indian Prime Minister. He also said that there was a very powerful answer by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He talked about that how the Indian government is reaching out to the Muslim groups and also Christians. He specifically mentioned something that is very important for his electorate back home. So these were the questions and of course answers which were raised on religious freedom, but by and large he stayed away from any controversy. In fact, there was a question also on the ongoing protests and violence in parts of Delhi, to which he responded that he has seen reports, but it's up to India. He clearly said, even in fact on the CAA, the controversial CAA Citizenship Amendment Law, he stayed away from controversy. He said that it is up to India. By and large, he reiterated what is the official stance of the State Department, the US State Department, that it is internal matter of India. But of course, it looks that it was privately raised, especially religious freedom. In fact, when we talk about his two-day visit, he started his statement from Ahmedabad, the big event which happened in Ahmedabad, in which he lauded India's unity and said that people here in India from all faiths, whether Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jews, can come together and pray. So largely this was something that was discussed, but he was able to answer and stay away from any kind of controversy.
Absolutely. Now, Donald Trump was very keen to steer clear of any controversy. He said at the start that he doesn't want any controversy to overshadow the gains that India and United States have made over the last 2 days. Now, of course, he mentioned the defense deal, the $3 billion defense deal that India has signed with the United States. But there are certain contentious issues, like for Kashmir, for example. India in the past has told Donald Trump that Kashmir remains a bilateral issue. And what was Trump's reaction today when he was asked about the Kashmir situation?
Well, in fact, let me say while he started his press conference, he said that he is not going to say anything controversial that may jeopardize the entire optics and the outcomes of this important 2-day visit. On Kashmir, he said clearly that the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan is a great friend of him, and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also a great friend of him, and he basically deviated towards terrorism, an issue this was raised by a lot of people here, a lot of reporters here, the terrorism emanating from Pakistan, to which he replied that Pakistan is working on this issue, and we have seen 2 times he has publicly raised Pakistan during his 2-day visit. First, of course, Ahmedabad showstopper event, and secondly at the press statement as well. He in a sense did not criticize Pakistan. He basically said that Pakistan is working, and of course because of the good relationship between Washington and Islamabad, Pakistan is working. It is not because of any other issue, but remember that Pakistan he cannot criticize as of now publicly because the Americans and the Taliban are going to sign a deal, and they know that Pakistan is needed on board, given the fact that the influence Pakistan has on the Taliban group, and that is why he didn't want to jeopardize that. So clearly he sent a message to Islamabad in a very nuanced manner.
One final question to you, Siddhant. He also mentioned, while speaking about Islamic terror in Pakistan, he acknowledged that there is an issue, but like you mentioned, he probably does not want to criticize the Pakistani establishment openly before that deal is signed with Taliban and in Afghanistan. But he also said that Prime Minister Modi is very firm in dealing with terror. So how are we supposed to read that statement that India is committed to fighting terrorism? Does the US support India's fight against terror?
Well, he used a very an important phrase which perhaps will become one of the quotable quotes from this entire visit. He said that India is a brave nation. When he talked about terrorism, he said he lauded, in fact, India's valor in terms of able to deal with terrorism. But by and large, his focus was on making sure that he is able to send a message to New Delhi that the Americans are with the Indians, but also send a message at the same time to the Pakistanis that you need to act on terrorism, but we also need you when it comes to the important Afghan deal. By and large, his focus on terrorism was Iran. He talked about that how Iran should basically act on the issue of terrorism. He said that Iran was in fact discussed with the Indian Prime Minister when both of them had the bilateral meeting at the Hyderabad house. But he was trying to deviate from the issue of terrorism when it comes to Pakistan, basically focusing on Iran, and that remains the standard US policy for them. The biggest country which is supporting terrorism, the biggest supporter of terrorism is Iran, and that is why he stayed away from that controversy and perhaps tried to blame Iran, which is the official policy as well when it comes to Washington. We saw the relationship between Iran and the United States over the start of this year. It wasn't very good. We saw how the Americans killed the top general of Iran, and after that it was looking like as if it's going to start a war, but by and large nothing happened, and that was expected also.
Right, Siddhant, stay with us. Also joining us on this broadcast is Richard M. Rosso, who is a US-India policy expert and senior advisor. He's live with us. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. So I'd like to welcome Richard to WION. Richard, it was a very interesting press conference by United States President Donald Trump. He spoke about the gains made over the last 2 days and also steered clear of a few issues. Let's first focus on the gains that United States and India have made over the last 2 days. First of all, of course, India-US signing a major defense deal worth $3 billion, and certain headway also made as far as a trade deal is concerned, isn't it?
Yeah, I think for India, with the contentious social issues that India is dealing with domestically, and the fact that we weren't able to come to final agreement on the trade deal, the fact the president came at all during a re-election year is a pretty significant step. And you're right, from the U.S. perspective, a trade deal would have been great. But concluding agreements to increase U.S. exports, both in defense material as well as U.S. hydrocarbons, are very notable as well. So I think the president is going to be able to come back to the United States and say he went to one of the biggest countries in the world and concluded tangible agreements to increase U.S. exports. So that'll play pretty well back home.
He also did mention, however, that India's tariffs were among the highest in the world. So that's something that he will speak to the Indian administration about. India, of course, sticking to its stand about maintaining the interests of Indian manufacturers. So do you see this trade deal, the headway made? Do you see a final deal taking shape towards the end of the year? What do you gauge out of these 2 days of discussions between the leadership of both nations?
It's great to hear the leaders commit to getting some kind of big trade deal, but at the same time, watching, I think, progress in both countries on concluding trade agreements. India, since Prime Minister Modi came into office 6 years ago, has essentially frozen or walked back from big trade agreements with Europe, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the RCEP. The United States reopened NAFTA and walked out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think it's terrific the leaders are saying the right kind of language. But knowing both our nations have massive trade deficits with the world, a lot of times the leaders have been pointing to previous trade agreements as kind of triggering that. So I think there's a lot more headwinds than the leaders are acknowledging sometimes on doing something like a free trade agreement. I do think something more narrow, where both sides would agree to remove some of the impediments, that seems a little bit more feasible. But a big free trade agreement, which got referenced a couple of times directly and indirectly, that seems like too heavy of a lift to actually reasonably do by the end of this year.
The big gain for United States, of course, was that major defense deal with India, like we mentioned earlier. Over the last 5 years, especially, United States has increased its defense exports to India. How will Donald Trump sell this deal back home in the United States, the $3 billion deal that the United States has signed with India? And do you see India and U.S. defense partnership strengthen further over the coming few years, like both the leaders have mentioned in the last 2 days?
Well, I do think U.S.-India defense relations will continue to grow. There really isn't so much concern anymore about the export of high-end defense material to India. I think 20 years ago, back when the United States tried to treat India and Pakistan with a bit more parity, there'd be a group that would come out and say, you know, we shouldn't allow export of really high-end U.S. military tech. That group does not really exist anymore, and so therefore there's very few voices, apart from one U.S. presidential campaign that would come out and complain about the transfer of advanced U.S. defense technology. So on the upside, in terms of why the relationship will grow and prosper, I think India looks around and sees China as playing a much larger and more aggressive role in the Indian Ocean region, and so therefore partnership with the United States makes a lot of sense. The negatives that are out there, the things that could really deter this, the number one that kind of stands in a lot of Americans' viewpoint is what's happening with India's continued defense relationship with Russia. You know, with the procurement of the S-400 missile defense system, and I gather now that the first deliveries may take place even by the end of this year, the United States is going to have to make a difficult decision in terms of whether we enact the existing U.S. sanctions law, or whether the relationship with India is important enough that we decide to use a very narrow ability to waive those sanctions. So that's probably the one thing I look at that might deter. Everything else looks like full steam ahead.
Right, Richard, stay with us. Also joining us on this broadcast is Arun Singh, a former ambassador to the United States. Let me put this question across to him. Now, Mr. Singh, how do you see U.S. reacting to this relationship that India has had with Russia over the last few decades as far as defense partnership is concerned? Of course, United States and India's defense partnership has increased manyfold over the last few years. But how will United States balance its relationship with India, because Russia continues to be India's largest defense partner as of today?
We have a legacy relationship with Russia, and Russia has been a reliable supplier of defense equipment to India. It has also provided political support to India at times when India has needed it critically. So it's a well-established, confident relationship. And when India is looking at ensuring its national security, it also needs to ensure that it is able to exercise the strategic autonomy of its decision-making for its national security purposes. I think the United States understands that. And therefore, when India, for example, is going in for purchase of S-400, it is clear that India needs that system for its own national security purposes. And US has to weigh and understand that now the relationship with US in defense is increasing. Till 2000, we had hardly bought any defense supplies from the US. So far, we had contracted to buy $18 billion of defense supplies. After that, we are also looking at a defense technology partnership. And just now, in the context of President Trump's visit, another $3 billion of defense supplies are being contracted. So the US has to weigh in its own interest that in this framework, if it wants to exercise sanctions against India in the context of India's purchase of S-400, then people in India, decision makers in India, will see that the US is not a reliable partner. And that is not in US interest. And even under US law, there is a waiver provision that the president has, which he can exercise if he can say that the relationship of that country with the United States is increasing. And it is certainly increasing, including in defense. So there is provision in that law for the US president to be able to exercise waiver. And my own assessment would be that it is in the interest of the United States itself to exercise that waiver from the law that they have. And that law itself is a product of US domestic political process. It was brought in by Congress because the Congress somehow felt that Russia had worked in favor of President Trump. President Trump has, of course, not accepted that. But, so it was a product of US domestic legal process. And to try and sort of cause any kind of an adversarial impact on relationship with another partner, important partner, something that is now being described as a comprehensive global strategic partnership, is not in US interest. And US has to understand that.
So US has to understand that. You mentioned, what do you think is the reasoning behind India increasing its defense partnership with the United States over the last few years? You mentioned Russia has been a reliable partner over the last few decades, but India has increased its defense imports from the United States in the last decade.
Well, not just the United States. India has many other partners. Russia has been an important partner for India. Israel is a very important partner for India in defense. France is a very important partner. We have bought the Rafale aircraft from France. Earlier, we had bought the Mirage from France. So again, France, we bought submarines from France. So France is also a very important partner in defense. And now the United States is emerging as a very strong partner. So if India says that the purpose of its national security policy is to maintain the autonomy of its decision-making process, it cannot have just one partner. So it has to look at multiple partners so that it is then able to take decisions based on its own assessments, based on its own interests. And so that's why, even though we have a good relationship with Russia and we continue to buy from Russia, in other areas where systems are available which are more cost effective, of higher levels of technology, for example, in several areas from the US, the C-17 long-haul aircraft is something that India has found very effective. Or the P-8I maritime surveillance aircraft, again, India has found very effective. Similarly, the purchases that are now being made of military helicopters. Right. That's the best available as far as India is concerned. So you make decisions based on what you feel is the best system in a particular area. Go for that and use that to leverage your various relationships.
Mr. Arun Singh, Richard and Siddhant, I request you all to stay with us. There was many more issues that Donald Trump touched upon in his press briefing, right from trade to Kashmir to CAA, religious freedom. We'd like to discuss all that with you, but stay with us. Let's first listen into some of the other comments made by US President, and we'll come back to this discussion.
Yeah, we're talking about the H-1Bs, and we are, look, the relationship we have, this is not from me, this is from almost everybody that saw it. They say in the history of India, which has a long history and a brilliant history in so many different ways, there's never been a reception given to somebody like was given, and I would like to say for the United States of America, but nobody else that came here got the kind of reception we got. It was 125,000, I think, seats they had yesterday. They were full. You had thousands and thousands of people outside. Prime Minister Modi was telling me thousands of people outside. That's not uncommon for me, to be honest with you, but when I look at 125,000 seats, and that was an incredible scene yesterday. In addition, all of those people lined up from the airport to the event. It was an incredible thing. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. The ambassador just told me that he's been in India for a long time. He's never seen, in fact, both ambassadors, our ambassador and the ambassador from India, said in 40 years he's never seen anything like it, what took place yesterday and, earlier than that. But yesterday, they've never seen anything like it. So it was a great compliment. It was a great compliment to our country. I'm the leader of the country, but it was a great compliment to our country. But Prime Minister Modi said today they've never, ever had any event like that. In fact, they said usually when somebody comes in, they have to look for people to fill up the areas. They said there was something very special. Look, it's a massive country in terms of its population, and people just wanted to pay their respect to the United States, and so I appreciate it. I was a recipient in a sense, but I was just really representing the country. We did talk about religious freedom, and I will say that the Prime Minister was incredible on what he told me. He wants people to have religious freedom, and very strongly, and he said that in India they have worked very hard to have great and open religious freedom. And if you look back and look at what's going on relative to other places especially, but they have really worked hard on religious freedom. I asked that question in front of a very large group of people today, and he talked about it. We talked about it for a long time, and I really believe that's what he wants. As far as the individual attack, I heard about it, but I didn't discuss that with him. That's up to India.
So Richard M. Rosso, U.S.-India policy expert, and Mr. Arun Singh, former ambassador to the United States, continue to be with us. Another important topic that Donald Trump mentioned, and we just heard him speaking about, was religious freedom. He said that India is very committed to religious freedom, and he, however, steered clear of the Citizenship Amendment Act. The question was asked him a couple of times, but Donald Trump said that is for Indian administration to deal with. Richard, how do you see this reaction by the United States President when he steered clear of CAA and gave his vote of confidence as far as Prime Minister Modi and his dedication towards religious freedom is concerned?
Well, I think several senior officials in the U.S. administration, in the Trump administration, have said that they're not going to drive international relations based solely on human rights issues. So while there are a lot of voices in the United States that would have liked the president to have put a lot more pressure on India in some of these contentious social issues, this isn't the administration that's going to do that. They have a longer-term view on things, and in as much as we see India as a rising market for U.S. products and services, as we see India as a growing defense partner, those really kind of led the day. So he brought issues up that he thought needed to be brought up privately, but didn't clearly stake the relationship on seeing movement in the direction that some in the United States would like to see on some of these contentious social issues.
Mr. Arun Singh, would you say that Indian administration might treat this, or some in India might treat this as United States vote of confidence for Indian administration's handling of the CAA, or is it something that President Trump simply steered clear of?
Look, it has been a long-standing position that other countries have no locus standi on issues that are internal to India. And therefore, whatever be the internal decision that the government of India takes, that's for the people and the political process in India to resolve, and not for any outsider to comment on that. And that has been a very firm position of India through governments, through decades. And so I think the US president here has taken the correct position that this is something that is internal to India. The democratic process and framework in India has to work it out itself if there are different viewpoints, and that's the way to go for it. But beyond that, if you've noticed, ever since he became president, unlike his predecessors, he has been emphasizing time and again that he wants to emphasize sovereignty of countries, and countries should take their own sovereign decision in relation to areas that come under their competence. And that is moving away from the policy that the US had followed, particularly since globalization started, when the US came under a unipolar moment or unipolar phase after dissolution of the Soviet Union, when they took positions on internal issues in different countries, and he saw things like regime change and other things on which there is a blowback now. And that's the framework under which President Trump has been elected, and he wants to draw down, in a sense, on US physical involvement externally. So it is in the framework of that, partly US own domestic compulsions and preferences, but more understanding that different democracies must resolve their own issues within their own internal processes and framework.
Right. You say that Donald Trump respects India's internal issues, but He did mention Kashmir, isn't it? And he once again said that he would like to help in any way that he can, maybe by even talks or even if mediation. Now, India has always maintained that Kashmir is an internal issue. It remains a bilateral issue, conflict between India and Pakistan.
So yes, India's position is very clear that Kashmir is an internal issue, but also that if there is something to discuss on Kashmir, it is discussing issues related to the area occupied by Pakistan. So, and therefore there is a certain external dimension to the Kashmir issue because Pakistan's illegal possession of a part of the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir. So it is in that framework, and because Pakistan keeps raising this issue, that other countries take positions. And I thought President Trump, although he did use the word mediate, he was not upfront in offering mediation. And he made a general comment about mediation on India-Pakistan. But Kashmir reference came up a little later. So it was a very general, not an upfront suggestion, but basically saying that I'm ready to help with both want, and that was the position that he took. And I think he also took it in the context that right now, US is trying to move its own process with Pakistan positively. And both yesterday and today, he spoke about US working with Pakistan to deal with terrorism that is there in Pakistan, because US needs Pakistan in the context of the dialogue they're having with the Taliban. So there is a certain approach to Pakistan which is very different from the approach that the US had towards Pakistan in 2017 after President Trump was elected. When in their South Asia strategy, they were very critical of Pakistan. Or in 2018, when President Trump had tweeted that Pakistan was hoodwinking the United States, had taken billions of dollars of assistance, and was not providing any cooperation. So right now, the tone and strategy is a little different, and so we have to factor that in, that there is a little bit of nuancing going on. But I think kind of articulation that was done, he was very, very careful, because if you saw right in the beginning of his press conference, he said that he was going to be careful, he was going to be conservative, and he was not going to say anything that would disrupt the major achievement that he has had in the visit so far, which by all accounts has been a very, very successful visit.
It has,
because
certainly.
he also wants to project back home that after his acquittal by the Senate, after a good State of the Union speech on February 4, he's come to India and he wants to show to his people that he gets international welcome and acclaim. And that will be an important part of his messaging for his elections as he heads to November. And I'm sure he would not like to disrupt that.
Richard, would you agree and share the sentiment that this visit was as important for Donald Trump to project back home as it was for the deals and the progress that certainly India and the United States have made in this visit? But like the ambassador was mentioning also about Kashmir, it was a nuanced statement like that Donald Trump gave, isn't it? He was critical of Islamic terror. He was critical of terror groups operating out of Pakistan. He acknowledged that terror groups operating on territories controlled by Pakistan is a concern, but stopped short of directly criticizing the Imran Khan government, even saying that he has a good relationship with Imran Khan. How is this a balancing act that the United States is playing between India and Pakistan?
Well, it's not really a balancing act. I mean, this is one narrow strand, which I know is pretty important to India. But if you look at the relationships in toto, there isn't much else we have going on right now with Pakistan other than trying to ensure a bit of cooperation as we think about the transition in Afghanistan. And then on the flip side, you think about the entire breadth of the relationship with India. So, from Washington's perspective, balance, it's not even a term that we even consider remotely anymore when we think about the relations and how we work with both India and Pakistan. It is good, I think, that the president, his language that he used on Kashmir was couched in a lot more general terms than what we've seen before. I mean, the reference once that Prime Minister Modi had asked him to intervene. I mean, if you'd have seen another comment like that coming out of the bilateral, that would have been problematic. But I think the language that he used, where if asked, he would offer to mediate, I think is versus what we've seen in the past is a lot more palatable. In terms of impact, domestically here in the United States, there's been a little bit more attention on this visit than maybe India would normally get. But I do think that this outreach that President Trump has made to the Indian American diaspora is pretty important. It's a relatively modest number, right? About 4 million people, I think, is kind of the high end that I've seen Indian Americans living here in the United States. But President Trump won election 3 years ago, not by getting a majority of Americans, but by focusing on narrow target groups that appeal, he can appeal with messaging. So if he's able to continue to bring in groups that otherwise, may be willing to kind of adopt the sort of strategy and the thinking that he has, it's well worth in an election year to spend a bit of time in India as well. It's a growing demographic and also relatively wealthy. So we'll see what kind of political returns he can generate back here because of the trip and the bonhomie that he's built up with Prime Minister Modi and with India.
Yeah, absolutely spot on, Richard. And even President Trump, during his briefing, was very vocal about his prediction as far as India's position in the global stage is concerned, saying that India will be a major player at the global stage, not only for the next 20, but 50 and 100 years. So acknowledging India's growing stature at the global stage. Let's listen into a couple more reactions by U.S. President Donald Trump. I'd request Ambassador Singh and Richard Rosso to stay with us.
I won the travel ban, as you probably know. A lot of people said I lost it. No, I won the travel ban, and we use the travel ban where we think there's, not based on religion, but where we think there's going to be trouble, where we're looking at certain countries. As you know, we added a few countries onto it, but we won the travel ban, and we won it in the Supreme Court. So the travel ban is not a thing against Muslims. It's a thing against areas where we don't want people coming into our country that are going to cause problems, cause harm, cause death, hurt our people, and I feel very strongly about that. India is going to be a tremendous player over the next, it's now, right? But over the next period of 50 years and 100 years, look, you're talking about the largest population in the world. You're talking about a tremendous country in terms of its heritage, its potential wealth, frankly. Right now, they have incredible potential. Economically, they have great potential. Their schooling system is getting better all the time. They're doing a fantastic job in certain sectors with respect to education. We see it. In the United States, we see it. We have a lot of Indian students coming to our schools. They're great students, and they've done fantastically well at our schools. But we have, thousands and thousands of people coming from India coming to our colleges in particular, schools, but our colleges in particular. No, India's got a phenomenal future. I mean, you can rarely think of a place that has a better future than India, and highly respected, especially with leadership like Prime Minister. Right? They're working on Kashmir. Kashmir has been a thorn in a lot of people's sides for a long time, and there are two sides to every story, but they've been working on that very hard. We discussed it at great length, terrorism. And I think we have some very good ideas. He's very, very strongly against terrorism. I'll tell you, Prime Minister Modi is a very religious man, as you know. He's a very calm man, but he's actually a very, very strong person, very tough, actually. I've seen him in action. And he's got that foremost in his mind, terrorism. We talked a lot about Pakistan. I have a very good relationship with Prime Minister Khan, very good. We talked about it today at length, actually, and Prime Minister Modi. And it's no question it's a problem, but it's a problem they're working on it. India is, it's a brave nation, too. There's no pullback from India. And we just hope, and I said I'll help, I'll do whatever I have to do if I can do that, because my relationship with both gentlemen is so good. We talked about exactly all of the things that you're talking about. We also talked about tariffs because, as you know, India is probably the highest tariff nation in the world, meaning charging tariffs to outsiders. And I said we have to stop that. We have to stop it, at least as it pertains to the United States. And I think we're understanding each other.
Right. Ambassador Singh and Richard M. Rosso continue to be with us on this broadcast as we decode Donald Trump's press briefing. And now, another important issue between India and the United States is trade, of course. Ambassador, the United States obviously criticizing India for the tariffs, but at the same time, President Trump was appreciative of more and more Indian businesses investing in the United States now as compared to earlier.
So although President Trump spoke about tariffs and said that India has perhaps the highest tariffs, by many calculations that Indians have done, tariff levels in India are not the highest. Many other countries have far higher tariff levels. So from India's point of view, that's not really a valid criticism or valid point to make. But of course, I think the US president using that as part of his sort of nuancing and pressure that he wants to generate. And while they talk about tariffs, as he himself admitted, the fact is that trade between the two countries has gone up. And it has risen by more than 10% a year for the past several years. It has reached a level of $160 billion. President Trump himself commented that in the 3 years that he has been president, U.S. exports to India have gone up by 60%. The trade surplus that India has with the U.S., which was about $30 billion 3 years ago, has now come down to about $20 billion. And if you look at India's trade surplus with U.S., which is about $20 billion, pales in comparison with China's trade surplus with U.S., which is $400 billion, which is the real problem. Because India, while it has a trade surplus with U.S., is an overall trade deficit country. So many of the criticism that is done vis-a-vis India on trade or U.S.-India trade is not really a valid criticism. But there is a certain amount of politics going on around that. We have to factor it in. And I believe that it's not really worthwhile looking at just market access issues based on here and now, the current items that are being traded. But the two countries need to look in a forward-looking manner, as the Indian Prime Minister said, look at Industry 4.0, look at emerging technologies of the 21st century. And in those areas, build new patterns of cooperation and exchanges so that the trade and economic relations between the two countries expand and we address issues related to deficits or surplus in that framework.
Now, Mr. Rosso, Donald Trump was also asked about the H-1B visa. Now, of course, India wants that skilled workers, skilled migrants from India should get easy access to work in America as well. That's a demand that the Indian side has. How do you see the U.S. balancing it out? Donald Trump really skipped the H-1B question and, in fact, went on to speak at length about how he received such a great welcome, that it was the grandest welcome for any foreign dignitary in India. But what progress do you see being made as far as the H-1B visas is concerned?
Well, it's an important thing to bring up. We talk about defense trade, energy trade, we talk about medical devices, so many other things. The backbone of U.S.-India relations, more important than defense, more important than any kind of, is IT services trade. It still remains the single biggest factor in U.S.-India relations. Most U.S. companies that have any kind of presence or operations with India, as well as the lion's share of Indian investment here in the United States, is related to IT services trade. We have two leaders that spend a lot more time talking about manufacturing, and so you don't hear as much discussion necessarily about IT and IT services and services overall. But it really is the economic backbone of the relationship, and I think the most significant part of it. The president has only limited ability to play around with the visa regime. A lot of it's governed by legislation, but there are some elements that the president can directly intervene in. They can, for instance, a lot deeper checks on whether or not there's an American citizen that might be relevant for a job where a company applies for an H-1B. President Obama issued an executive order stating that spouses of H-1B employees can actually work as well. That's something that the president has the ability to revoke, since it's a presidential order, an executive order, rather than legislation. So it's good that it got brought up, because I think right now services probably doesn't get nearly enough attention considering its importance. H-1Bs is probably one of the most significant issues that Indian technology services firms face in terms of a block and potential worsening of the business environment in the United States. So I'm glad it got brought up, but it will be a mix between how U.S. Congress chooses to engage India as well as the administration, since coverage of immigration law resides in both bureaus.
Right, Mr. Richard M. Rosso, Ambassador Singh, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Donald Trump had a very freewheeling press briefing, like he mentioned, but steered clear of the majority controversial issues, focusing on the gains that have been made over the last 2 days. Gains certainly made in the defense sector, $3 billion worth of deals signed. Gains certainly made as far as a potential trade deal is concerned as well. Both sides expecting a formal trade deal may be signed by the end of this year. It's time for a very short break, but you must stay with WION World as one. We'll continue our rolling coverage of Donald Trump's visit to India.